All right, welcome all to our OBO Academy talk for today. We're going to have the part two of a ongoing discussion slash workshop slash informative session by Chris Mungle of the Lawrence Berkeley National Laboratory on how we can better integrate large language models into our process of working with OBO ontologies and beyond. Um, yeah, without any further delay, I'll hand it over to Chris.
All right, thank you, Harry. Let me share my slides. All right, so as Harry said, this is part two in a series. Here's a link to the slide deck. Both part one and part two are combined in the same slide deck. Just to kind of like recap where we left off with part one. And if you haven't seen it, the recording is available, and all the slides are also available. We have a Zenodo DOI where we keep the PDF and the PowerPoint of the slides. And really, part one focused on ontology generation and ontology augmentation. We talked about, just being able to kind of like work with robot template friendly CSVs, just using kind of like standard web UIs onto existing LLMs like the ChatGPT interface, the Claude interface. And we also looked at a little robot GPT helper as well that helped us kind of like kind of maintain state and develop an ontology as a robot template purely within the Chat GPT interface. And so part one didn't was deliberately aimed to kind of just show how you can use standard off-the-shelf models and off-the-shelf UIs that are available. There was no programming required. You didn't even have to install anything on your machine, and there was no kind of like using of any bespoke tools. Just also to kind of like update you, since we presented on part one, some of the people, some on this call, took some of those methodologies and they used it to help build an ontology. This isn't an OBO ontology because it's more general than the biosciences, but some people on this call, such as Harry and others, developed something called the AIO, the Artificial Intelligence Ontology, and because it's just nice and circular, we used AI to help construct the AIO itself. So you can have a read of that later on. So whereas part one focused more on ontology generation and augmentation, we're going to be talking today more about one of my favorite topics, which is validation and QC. And I think this is really important. I think quality of ontologies and knowledge bases is going to be the most important weapon we have in when we start to see kind of like a slew of AI tools that purport to just be able to do things directly by reading the literature and so on. I think having high quality ontologies and knowledge bases is going to be absolutely key in multiple aspects. Now, it may seem contradictory, saying we need high quality to defend against unreliability in AI, but yet we're going to use AI to help us with quality control. But in fact, provided you don't take everything it says as face value, AI can be very useful, essentially as a kind of like a second set of eyes over your work. So don't necessarily trust everything it says, but if you want to give it a very large task involving review of kind of like sometimes hundreds of terms or more, it can be very good just to get a kind of like a second opinion, and it may spot things that you did not spot yourself. And so that's really very much the theme of today. I'll maybe if we've got time we can demo some things, but otherwise I've got some kind of canned examples I can show you. Unfortunately, we do not have the full hour today. Um, and again, no programming experience is required to use any of the tools today. But it does take a little bit of technical expertise to install a few Python tools that you can then run on your command line. And this is not the most polished presentation. The idea here is really just to kind of like start a conversation about ways in which we can use some of our existing tools to perform various kinds of review workflows. So yeah, I really encourage anyone to kind of like just jump in with any kind of questions or discussions as we go along. My goal here is really not to say these are the set of tools you should use. This is the workflow you should use. I don't think any of us know exactly the best way to deploy these tools at the moment. My goal is to really kind of make you feel empowered to do your own experiments and kind of explore for yourself. And then us as a community can kind of come up with recommendations and guidelines and benchmarks and so on, to really help us all. So I think everything I'm going to show you today makes use of OAK, the Ontology Access Kit. I'm going to assume some basic kind of like familiarity, but I'll do a quick recap first. Here's the URL for it. And if you have not used OAK before, I really strongly recommend it. We've done kind of presentations on OAK in previous OBO Academies, but things have really progressed in kind of leaps and bounds since then. And I tend to find that there's just a lot of tasks that people are doing kind of like manually or kind of like kludging together existing workflows can be done with kind of like single commands in Oak. And maybe we've not done enough to kind of like proselytize some of this. But really, there's a channel for Oak in the OBO Slack, and I really kind of encourage people, independent of the slides today, to check it out and to try integrating it into your tasks. It does require a kind of Python install on the command line, and you may need some kind of like technical help for that if you're not familiar with that. But once you've done that, you can it's very powerful for a number of different tasks. So just to give a brief recap here. So we're going to be using Oak on the command line. If you're a Python developer, you can use Oak directly via Python API, but we're not going to be covering that today. There's actually quite a lot of different commands in Oak, but it helps to kind of like think of them in terms of like being structured in terms of these simple kind of like verb noun actions. So the main verbs in Oak are doing a kind of like a query or lookup. So this may be look up all the mappings in my ontology, or look up all my definitions, or look up a subgraph based around a particular term of interest, following the is it and part of relationships up the graph. Um, and this is really the kind of like the mainstay in the original use case of Oak doing these kind of lookup operations is called the ontology access kit. But there's an increasing number of commands that follow other verbs. There's the generate family of commands, so you can do things like generate mappings, aka lex match. You can do things like generate synonyms using synonymizer rules. You can generate definitions. You can generate change lists by, for example, giving two ontologies, which is essentially a diff. There's kind of apply commands for applying those changes to the ontologies. But today we're going to look at the newer validate family of commands, and this includes validating an entire ontology, or just validating kind of like different aspects of an ontology, like validating the mappings or the definitions or the synonyms. So, and again, just to kind of like recap some of the Oak basics, Oak is designed to access with a wide variety of different backends. You can use it with local files on your file system. You can use it with remote endpoints like Ubergraph or BioPortal. Um, the one we encourage to use the most is the pre-built SQLite versions of each ontology, because SQLite turns out to be very very nimble and very fast. So this is often the kind of like the fastest way to do different kinds of operations. But there's also other kinds of adapters. These are more like functionality-based adapters. They include the Gilda adapter that gives you kind of like named entity recognition. There's a Panther API adapter to do enrichment. And today we're going to be looking at this newer LLM optional adapter. So, and just to emphasize, everything to do with LLMs in Oak is entirely optional. It's entirely a layer on top. The core of Oak will never, I don't think ever, rely on LLMs. It is based around doing kind of like crisp, logically defined operations. The LLM stuff is entirely optional. So we have a how-to guide now on how to use LLMs in combination with Oak. I encourage you to take a read of that. I won't go into the kind of like the full installation details, but because it's an optional extra, you have to do this additional piece of magic to kind of like if you want to install it in your environment, where you basically put in square brackets the name of the extra, and you can list other extras here as well, and there will be an increasing number of extras over time. These instructions may not work, for everyone. Some people prefer to install with pipx. Um, Maybe at some point, this will all be available in the ODK Docker. Unfortunately, installation in Python is never super straightforward, but we can, there's help available if you want to do this and you run into issues. Just ask on the Oak channel in Slack. So we'll start just with a kind of like a recap of some basic kind of lookup operations in Oak. Um, Here's this command here can be used to find all descendants of autophagy in the gene ontology. I'll kind of like the basic idea here is that we give it a kind of like a query, and we're jumping right into some of the more advanced aspects of Oak here, where you can give it's got essentially its own graph query language, where you can do things like find all is it descendants of autophagy, and the output looks something like this. I've loaded it into a kind of like a table viewer, but it will essentially give you this command will essentially give you a table of all definitions. So let's maybe go to a slightly more advanced example here. Maybe we want to not just get the definitions, but get a complete sub-ontology in OBO format. I'll kind of like walk through the individual parts of this command here. This first part tells you what source you're going to use, and here we're going to use the pre-built SQLite version of the gene ontology. Then the actual command that we used is the info command, which is basically the kind of like the standard kind of like give me information on this ontology term. Then next we have a query, which is all is it and part of descendants of the term labeled autophagy in the Go. And then finally, we're going to output this in OBO format. OBO format was designed originally to be something that was compact and readable for humans. It turns out that compact and readable for humans, compact and readable also works quite nicely for AIs as well. You have a limited size of a context window typically with using LLMs, and it turns out OBO format actually manages to kind of like pack a lot of the key information in a relatively compact amount of space. And then we're going to kind of like redirect that to a file that we just call autophagy.obo. Okay, so let's say we've done some work on the ontology on a particular branch, such as this branch, and maybe we want to review it, and maybe we want to review it against a particular kind of key publication or something like that. So I picked this review, at random, like lysosome biology and autophagy. So maybe we might want to perhaps we've used this review to help us kind of like structure the ontology, but maybe we think we may have like kind of like missed something, so we'd like a second pair of eyes to look over our work. And so using the Claude AI, which is nice as it has quite a large context window. You can give it like fairly large documents. And in my experience, it seems to do kind of quite well here compared to other models. Other LLMs are coming online that also have large context windows, such as Gemini. But in my from my limited experiments, Claude seems to be keeping the edge in terms of being able to kind of like stay on track with large documents. So what I've done here is simply paste this branch of the ontology that I've extracted using Oak. Yeah, and if you like, you can extract these branches using Robot or other tools as well. It doesn't really matter so much for our purposes today. And I just uploaded the PDF of the review as well. And then I've asked it to just kind of like give review this branch of the ontology. I asked it to stick to content changes because otherwise it starts like, telling me about, format changes it might like and things like that. I also mentioned that this is for the biological process branch only. I don't want any recommendations for cell components or complexes. And then it kind of like gives me back a set of recommendations. These are not unreasonable. In general, it hasn't found any mistakes here, and that's not surprising because this branch of the Go actually just went um, recent refactoring and tidying up. So we hope it's largely correct. Um, what it's tending to suggest here is to kind of like give a little bit more detail in some of the definitions than we would typically give in the Go. It's kind of veering into being a bit more species specific here. But yeah, I find it kind of interesting just to get this alternate perspective as well, because some of our work in the Dragon AI evaluation has kind of shown that often people actually prefer a little bit more detail in the definitions for ontology terms than we typically give. So so this is a kind of very kind of like easy workflow. Even without using Oak, you can kind of just copy and paste kind of like, bits of your ontology into existing AIs and just ask it to review these directly against ontology guidelines, against review articles and so on. Um, so that's so yeah, I definitely encourage you to try these kinds of workflows. We're going to jump over now to the actual validate family of commands within Oak itself. And so at the moment, there's 5 different commands here. There's validate, which does an entire ontology validation, but you can also choose to validate definitions, validate mappings, validate multiple ontologies, validate synonyms, and there may be more of these commands in the future. So again, just to emphasize that the LLM mode in Oak is entirely optional. Um, Essentially, if you run things without the LLM adapter, it essentially uses kind of like standard rule-based mechanisms to apply these kinds of validations over your ontology. So an example of rule-based validation may be things like cardinality constraint checks, making sure that you don't have more than one textual definition for any given term, because that's not allowed. It may also involve doing external lookups, making sure if you have cited a particular reference in for your definition or for your synonym, that actually exists as a URL. If it's a PMID, it's not being retracted, that kind of thing. But then you can also essentially run these commands in LLM mode, where you pass in your model of choice. Um, this may require kind of like you getting kind of API keys, and if you don't have the ability to get API keys yourself, then you can reach out to us on the OBO Slack channel, and we can see if we can set you up with some. So I'll go over just kind of like the basic rule type validation before we go into LLM validation. Some of you may be unaware of these checks, even though they've been in Oak for a while. So we'll start by talking about a subject kind of close to my heart, which is validation of textual definitions. Um, so Oak implements something that I call the SRS taxonomy. This is a table from one of my favorite ontology papers, Guidelines for Writing Definitions in Ontologies by Sapala, Rottenberg, and Smith. And what they did is they essentially came up with a taxonomy of rules that you should follow in writing your definitions. Um, I think these are very good rules. Sometimes I'm a little bit suspicious if people try to be a bit too prescriptive in writing these kinds of rules. I think at the end of the day, we have to craft our definitions to be human readable and to be approachable by the end users of the ontology. Having said that, I think these are very good rules that everyone should be aware of. And in cases where you do want to deviate from them, it should be intentional rather than accidental. So the ones that are bolded are the ones that are currently implemented just using the plain Oak rule-based validation. We can run through an example of this. Again, let's say that we want to just go through a branch of our ontology and apply validations, validate definitions to this. So you can pass in on the command line either the whole ontology, a single term, or in this case, a branch of the ontology. Um, so to kind of like get a sense of the output, I'll kind of like show you one term in the Go, which is chaperone mediated autophagy. So the definition here is the autophagy process, which begins when chaperones and co-chaperones da. We will see that this, when we run oak validate over this, it flags that it is violating rule number S3, which is the rule that says that the logical definition and the textual definition should match up in some sense of the term matchup. And in this particular case, we can see that the genus used in the text definition is the autophagy process, whereas the actual term in Go is autophagy. I suspect this is due to the fact that maybe at one stage we called the term autophagy process, which is, to my mind, sounds just a little bit kind of like abstract. And I think this is flagging something perfectly legitimate, that we should use just the simpler term in the text genus of the definition here. And again, so just to emphasize, this is just using simple lexical rules over the form of the text definition. No complex NLP, no large language models here yet. There's actually, like many oak commands, there's a Jupyter notebook that you can run to kind of like try this. So I'll just kind of switch briefly over to this notebook at the moment. So you yeah, yeah, I don't believe these notebooks will run on kind of external, kind of like cloud-based providers like Notebook Viewer at the moment, but you can run some of these yourself if you're familiar with like getting a Jupyter environment set up. So first of all, the first thing that we do is just kind of like run the command in help mode, and it kind of like gives us all of the different kind of like command line options and so on. So just to show this works, we're going to do validation over a simple test ontology that has been deliberately engineered to be full of these kinds of problems. So we're not actually validating a real ontology here. So we're going to kind of like restrict our queries to the branch cellular component here. And so we're going to run oak over this validate defs test file, which has the deliberate errors in it. So we'll run that, and just because it looks nicer in a Jupyter notebook, we're going to use pandas here to look over the results. And you can see it kind of like gives you this table here of all the issues. It's kind of like flagged with the definitions. So we can see all of the different kind of like IDs that are used here. Let's maybe look at it in this form. Will tell us how many of the different SRS rules that have been kind of like broken here, and we can maybe kind of like filter this, look at a subset of some of these columns, and then if you were doing this yourself, you might load the TSV into Excel or Google Sheets or something like that. But just because this is a Jupyter notebook, we're just going to kind of like do some simple pandas queries to kind of like filter these results for different categories of validation error. So let's look for the most trivial type, which is S0. So these are kind of like terms that don't have any definition at all. So there's, of course, in the real Go, endomembrane system does have a definition, but in this test version of it, it does not. So we can also do a query for definitions that lack standard genus differentia structure. I'm a big fan of having genus differentia structure in such a way that they are kind of human readable across all of our ontologies. So the first thing this check does is to make sure that the definitions follow this structure. Then we can, there's other kinds of tests we can look for as well. There's circular definitions are often a kind of like a big problem. So this will this flags our deliberately kind of planted error here, where we define a thylakoid in terms of a thylakoid, and so on. You can see, you can get the general idea where we can kind of like filter out the definition violations for these different classes of definitions. I also deliberately kind of like made a fake ontology term here that had that used a publication that has been retracted. It will go off to PubMed and it will do a lookup, kind of like caching those results so we don't hammer the PubMed API, and tell you if that publication has been retracted. So in this case, the fake publication, yeah, the fake term does indeed have this, so it gets flagged using this additional rule. And we're extending the existing SRS taxonomy here because it doesn't have rules about kind of like matching with what's in publications. Okay, so that's again standard standard kind of like rule-based validation. Let's maybe move over now into validating definitions with large language models. So the key here is that you can use again using you wrap an existing adapter with an LLM, and so the syntax here is you just prefix your normal OAK adapter with LLM, and then you can also optionally give the name of a particular model you want to use here. We leverage a tool set called Dataset LLM here that provides essentially kind of like a gateway to multiple different models. So you can explore different ones if you don't want to use just the standard chat GPT models. I won't today go into some of the steps that you need to do to install the kind of plugins to make this work, but they're all there in the OAK LLM guide, and you can get help on the Slack channel if you need to. So one of the things that this validate definitions command will do in LLM mode is it'll go off to PubMed, it will look up the reference, pull back the abstract. Maybe in future it'll pull back the full text as well. We're just kind of experimenting with this at the moment. And it will say, is the definition that was chosen for this ontology, does it actually match the content of what this publication says? And you might be surprised how often these things, these deviate, maybe because definitions change over time, but old publications are kind of like kept in place. So to illustrate this, we're going to look at micromatophagy in the Go, degradation of the mitochondrion by microautophagy, to be contrasted with macroautophagy. So if we were to manually go off to PubMed and look at this, we'd see there's a publication titled Selective Mitochondrial Autophagy or Mitophagy as a target of defense, blah, blah, blah. But what might not be obvious to begin with, but if we actually run this through OAK, this is the output it gives us. It essentially gives us a score of how well the text definition matches what is in the abstract, and in this case it says the alignment between the term definition and the reference is low. And the reason for this is actually quite important, that this publication is really about macroautophagy rather than microautophagy. So it's kind of like almost the inverse of what we want to use as the support here. And in fact, since this was flagged by the tool, we're kind of like removing this this reference from the Go. And it might be kind of like tedious to do this kind of individually, but this kind of points us ways of kind of like using this tooling to kind of like do some of these things on masse. Just to kind of give you a sense of another example here, actually just given time and the fact that we have to finish early, I'm going to kind of like skip through this one kind of quite quickly. It's the biology is quite interesting, but I don't think we've got time to go into it. So at the moment, when you run OAK validate definitions, it will do lookups of your publications. It will only make use of PM IDs at the moment, but it will be very straightforward to add this for PMC IDs, for DOIs, and for just general kind of like URLs in the wild as well. Maybe Wikipedia as well. So these are kind of like common definition sources. It will also make use of external ontologies and external databases. This is a not uncommon pattern where, for example, in the Go, we maybe will use EC or REA as a definition source for reaction definitions. So it can make use of both external ontologies and external databases and ontologies. And there's a whole ongoing discussion in OBO at the moment about the best way to kind of like make ontology-based representation of kind of things that are traditionally regarded as databases. But the short story is kind of like, thanks to some of the work of Charlie Hoyt, you can now actually access a number of databases like EC and REA as if they were ontologies, and just use them within this kind of like oak checking mechanism here. So kind of very briefly, let's go on to validation of mappings. So the basic syntax here is you type validate mappings, and again, like most oak commands, you can pass individual IDs, lists of IDs, files of IDs, or branch type queries. Here we're going to validate all the mappings for all descendants of molecular function. And again, this is just standard basic oak functionality. We're not wrapping this in an LLM. We're just going to do standard rule-based checks, which involve checking the cardinality of exact matches to make sure they're one-to-one, and also going off doing external database lookup or external ontology lookup to make sure that we're not mapping to entities that don't exist or that have been obsoleted, where our base term is itself not obsolete. So you can, yeah, I won't go into the kind of like the basic rule-based results there, but I encourage you to try that with your existing mappings. But this newer feature will wrap the validate mappings command with an LLM here, and it essentially uses a methodology that that we described in this this mapper GPT paper. The functionality is now directly within Oak. What it will basically do is it will do a lookup, an ontology lookup of your subject and your object in your SESM file, or the mappings that are embedded in your ontology, and essentially just present these objects, you know, with their definitions and maybe with some external context about their relationships, and say, hey, the ontology says these two things are exactly the same. Do you agree? And yeah, we can use this on existing ontologies. Again, I've been looking at kind of like reactions and mappings between Go molecular functions and reactions in EC and REA and other databases lately. So this is just one example of a mapping between the REA ID 23052, which has a reaction as kind of shown here, and the Go term for pyruvate dehydrogenase acetyltransferrin kinase activity. And yeah, so, sorry, this is kind of like not very readable, kind of like JSON output, but you know, you can do this as tables and so on. And you know, it has essentially kind of like flagged this one as being problematic because the text definition and the actual reaction are different in this one case. So I think with that, that's probably kind of like just a good time to stop. I see there's a few questions in the chat, and we've got about kind of like 5 minutes before I have to head off. So thank you. Any questions?
Thank you very much, Chris. Anyone wants to get started on questions? I will start with a warm up then. So for the did you kind of even if it's just eyeball quantification, did you ever try to quantify the relevancy of the results, especially the LLM ones, results from the validate command, where relevance is let's say defined as like a number of actionable feedback divided by total feedback? So are you searching for the kind of feedback that makes you apply a change as a curator, or does it jump at you and you say like, wow, that's a problem? First feedback, second feedback, that's a problem, we need to do this. So what's your kind of like rough over eyeball estimation of how much search there is required from the curator to find the good one?
So I don't think we've kind of quantified in that level of detail yet. I think what you're alluding to is basically, we all have like, yeah, a huge number of reports to kind of like pile through, and maybe it's not always always useful to get yet another kind of like thing of here's kind of like 1,000 potential changes. One thing that we've been doing is kind of like basically doing a kind of ensemble approach where you maybe run the same thing through multiple different models, and you essentially kind of like have them vote, and if like 4 out of 5 of them say that there's a problem, then this one is likely kind of like high priority. So that's what we've been kind of like trying a little bit so far. And that seems to be, kind of like one yeah, kind of like good way of doing this. But I think it really depends on, you know, your your individual kind of like workflow. There's a number of different ways to integrate these commands into your workflow. So I think if you want to do something like validate all the mappings in my entire ontology, for most ontologies, that's going to be, generate something that is kind of quite a lot of work. So what I recommend is kind of like weaving this more into kind of existing workflows where you're working on a particular branch, you run some of these commands, you get back kind of like feedback, you kind of like scan that and just use that to kind of like, essentially kind of like, refine your search and so on.
Very good, thank you.
All right, I got a quick question, Chris. Does the Oak LLM implementation expose any of the model parameters like temperature?
Not at the moment, no, no. But that would be something that'd probably be quite useful to add. But right now, yeah, the only access of control you have is over the model itself. Mhm.
For the mapping validation, do you pull in object information if it's not present in the ontology, or does the person that passes in the information have to make sure that the object information is also part of the ontology that is worked on?
Yeah, no, with many things in Oak, it's designed to be sort of like very convenience oriented. So we'll actually go off and do a lookup, and if now it will do the lookup based on looking at the kind of like the prefix, and it'll say look up this kind of ontology in the semantic SQL registry, which is a superset of the OBO registry. So you'll have things in there like Rhea, like Ordo, and so on. But it's not always the case that that prefix matches up with an actual kind of like ontology. So you can pass in essentially a set of mappings and say, for this prefix, I want you to look up this in BioPortal, or I want you to look at this in my file. So the basic idea is it should do the right thing 95% of the time, but you have that kind of fine-grained control of where to look up if you like.
Thank you very much. That's super useful. Thank you so much. I'm very happy I insisted on you giving this talk, because this is really valuable. And thanks for doing this despite your tight schedule at the moment. I know you
All
have to
right.
leave, so let's say thank you one more time. And
Thank you. Yeah. And yeah, just to emphasize again, the goal here is to just kind of like start a conversation and explore some of the different ways we can like make use of some of these workflows. All right. Very good. See you all later.
see you, Chris. Bye.